Well, good evening and welcome to Hampshire College lecture series on science and religion. The topic of science and religion is always in the news, and recently regarding on the one hand you have the stem cell debate or the teaching of intelligent design in schools, and on the positive side you also have issues where the religion and science is coming together on issues like global warming. Similarly, you have different books coming along. You have books written by scientists who are believers, like Francis Collins, who wrote a book called Language of God. And then you also have books by scientists which are more in conflict with religion, like books like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, which has been on the New York Times bestseller for the last 20 weeks or so. Now, taking advantage of these different issues dealing with science and religion, Hampshire College has started to arrange this lecture series. It's a 3-year lecture series on science and religion, dealing with different issues over 3 years. The first year deals with nature, belief, and supernatural. Our first speaker was Paul Bloom in October. Today we have David Sloan Wilson. I will introduce him in a short while. And our next speaker will be Lawrence Principe on April 12th, and he will talk about natural and supernatural. And we have some flyers for his talk, his abstract, and his introduction back over there strategically placed next to the cookies. The cookies are gone. Okay, well, the flyers may still be there. Well, that was also a strategy. The second year of our lecture series will deal with science and religion, a history of conflict and cooperation. And then we will conclude this lecture series with dealing with bigger issues, a matter of origins and the meaning of life. So today we are delighted to have Professor David Sloan Wilson with us. And I should mention, before I go, some of our sponsors for this lecture series, so I will introduce him in a second, but for the sponsors, so this event is sponsored by Hampshire College Initiative of Integrated Science and Humanities, Office of the President, Office of the Dean of Faculty, the Schools of Natural Science, Cognitive Science, and Humanities and Cultural Studies. And while we are at the subject, I should also thank New York Times, for their sponsorship of our lecture. Not really a sponsorship, but they came out with this last Sunday magazine section was devoted to how we believe and why we believe. So why do we believe? Well, I have to look at that, and they must have changed my idea. And in that article, it did mention Dr. Sloan Wilson. He was quoted in there, so it was timed nicely. So thank you to the New York Times also. Now, I should introduce Dr. Sloan Wilson. He's a distinguished professor of biology with a joint appointment in anthropology at Binghamton University, which was, I think, SUNY Binghamton before that, so now it's Binghamton University. He's the founder and director of EVOS, a campus-wide program that uses evolutionary theory as a common language for studying all human-related subjects in addition to the natural world. Amongst his other than his scientific publications, he is the author of Unto Others, The Evolution and Psychology of Unselfish Behavior, which was co-authored with Elliot Sober, Darwin's Cathedral, Evolution, Religion, and the Nature of Society, and his first book for a general audience, which I'm assuming it's coming out at the end of March,
yes.
Or end of March, so here's a plug for his book, Evolution for Everyone, and so everyone is here, how Darwin's theory can change the way we think about our lives. So please welcome Dr. Sloan Wilson, David Sloan Wilson.
Well, thank you very much. Let's start right in. What's the first sideshow here? The creationism, intelligent design debate. Lots of press. Here's a cover of Time magazine and a very clever cartoon, I think, in which the back of the sign is the cross here. And why a sideshow? Actually, I think it's important to say that explaining the world as designed by a creator is a perfectly respectable scientific hypothesis, especially before the days of Darwin, but unfortunately it has failed to explain the facts of the world again and again and again. This is a quote from the actually that Darwin used in the preface of The Origin of Species, the first edition by William Whale, written in 1833, which says, "But with regard to the material world, we can at least go so far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws." So even before Darwin, scientists had concluded that you're not going to make much progress at all by assuming a supernatural agent that intervenes in any kind of special fashion. We have to explain the world in terms of natural laws, and there's nothing in modern intelligent design theory to distinguish it from earlier forms of creationism. The most recent test of this was the famous trial in Dover, Pennsylvania, and Judge Jones, a conservative judge appointed by Bush, nothing to gain by this, concluded in his brief the breathtaking inanity. And part of this, this is recounted in detail in this book here, Tower of Babel by Robert Pennock, who was a special expert witness for this trial. And one of the things they did during this trial was that they subpoenaed various versions of this textbook here, which went through a number of revisions. And this is the main intelligent design textbook. And what they discovered was that in various modifications of this textbook, what they had simply done was they had cut out words such as creation science and design theory, creation science and creationists, and pasted in design theory and design proponents. That's the degree to which intelligent design was simply repackaging creationism. And they even made a mistake now and then, such as this here they discovered, which was humorously called the missing link, the transitional form between creation science and intelligent design. So there comes a point where really we should be able to conclude we don't have to pay much attention to this. This is not a serious intellectual debate here. We can spend our time much better going on to other things. Well, what is the second sideshow? The second sideshow, I claim, are books by Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion and Breaking the Spell, by Dan Dennett. Also enormous coverage. There's another cover of Time magazine. You just said that Dawkins' book is still on the best seller list. How on earth can I call this a sideshow when Dawkins is a preeminent evolutionist and Dennett is a preeminent philosopher and spokesperson for evolution? Certainly their credentials are as good as anyone's that you could ask for, but nevertheless, they are committed to a notion of religion as fundamentally bad for people and something that the human race could be better off without. I've reviewed both of these books, and I have to tell you that reading them made me think I was watching that old movie Reefer Madness, where one whiff and you're completely off your rocker, you know. And I actually titled my review of Dennett's book, "A Scientific Exorcist Casts Out Demonic Memes." It's that religion comes in and it possesses you, just like the demons of old, and you have to cast it out now by science. And so the question is this conclusion scientifically justified? Is there any way that we can actually affirm their view of religion scientifically, and especially with evolutionary theory, or is this their personal prejudice? Are they angry atheists that are basically, forgive me, trading on their reputation of scientists and intellectuals in order to air these views? Now here's some of what I mean. This is some quotes from Dan Dennett's book. On religious conflict, you're basically killing each other to see who has the best imaginary friend, as if religious conflict just has this basis, you know. And on religious ascetics, in what way are they morally superior to people who have devoted their lives to improving their stamp collections or their golf swing? So religious ascetics are evidently just self-obsessed people sitting in their caves, you know, doing no good for anyone, not even themselves, right? So they've got the demonic meme. Here's the preface to Richard Dawkins' book. He says, "Imagine, with John Lennon, a world with no religion. Imagine no suicide bombers, no 9/11, no 7/7, no crusades, no witch hunts, no gunpowder plot, no Indian partition, no Israeli-Palestinian wars, so on and so forth. As if we could somehow banish religion, then the world would become a better place." So what is the main event? The main event, I claim, is the proper study of religion as a natural phenomenon from an evolutionary perspective as a respectable scientific discipline. And the New York Times article does a fairly good job at portraying that, and I really want to commend you guys for putting on this series, basically, and for identifying this as a very, very interesting subject and a very new subject, and not at all like either of these sideshows. And I guess the main point of my talk is to convince you of this very interesting new field of evolutionary religious studies, which is much more interesting and significant than either of these sideshows. So here are the main goals for my talk. I'm going to give you the conclusions first in case I don't get all the way through them. One point to make is that religion has already been abundantly studied as a natural phenomenon. If you've read Dan Dennett's book, the subtitle is Religion as a Natural Phenomenon, and one of the themes of the book is we really must study religion as a natural phenomenon. Well, I can tell you the volume of religious scholarship is mind-boggling. Just incredible. You could spend many lifetimes learning about information on religion. Some of it is quantitative. There's a large social science literature on religion, and much of it is descriptive, traditional religious scholarship. So it's absurd to say that religion has not been studied as a natural phenomenon. Most religious studies departments, that's the difference between a theology department and a religious studies department. And in a religious studies department, everyone, regardless of their religious beliefs, are studying religion as a natural phenomenon. They're not creationists, they're not special interventionists, so we have an enormous amount of information to deal with. It's not a matter of needing more information. The real problem is organizing this information. And I think that there's a really nice analogy to be made between our knowledge of religion today and our knowledge of geology and natural history at the time of Lyell and Darwin. There was a lot known back then, gathered by the geologists and the natural historians of their day, many of whom were creationists and thought they were studying the hand of God. But it was good descriptive information. And what the theory, Lyell's theory of geology and Darwin's theory of evolution did was that they took all of that information and provided a way of organizing it. That's what we need for religion. So evolutionary theory can expand beyond biology and provide a framework for understanding religion along with all other human-related subjects. And here I'm in full agreement with Dennett and Dawkins, both colleagues of mine. And so we would all agree on this point. And I think it's very important to say in general terms that if you take a long view of intellectual history, evolutionary theory has been confined to the biological sciences and only a few human-related subjects, such as human genetics and physical anthropology, for most of the 20th century, for reasons that are complex. But only during the last 10 or 15 or 20 years has evolution been busted out of basically the biological sciences and is now being applied to virtually every human-related topic that you can think of, including but not restricted to religion. And so these are very exciting times intellectually, and what I'm reporting for the subject of religion can be repeated for innumerable human-related subjects. Number 4, there are a number of major evolutionary hypotheses about religion, of which the demonic meme hypothesis is just one. And I will outline the major hypotheses about religion in just a moment. And Dawkins and Dennett would certainly, I'm sure, would agree with this. 5, evolution is a messy and multifactorial process. So all of the major hypotheses have an element of validity for religion, no less than biology. If you're a biologist studying evolution, you know that some things are evolved by selection, some by drift, some by hitchhiking, byproduct effects. Many different evolutionary forces are out there, and so it's a messy process. Now 6, I claim that when we evaluate existing information from an evolutionary perspective, we have enough information to reject the demonic meme hypothesis and to establish another hypothesis that groups as adaptive units as the primary explanation of religion, by no means the exclusive one. But if we could say only one thing about religion, it would be a modernized, revived version of what Durkheim said. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. There's something very functional about religion in terms of solving the practical problems of this world's life for members of the religious group. But even after we make this statement, this is not entirely benign. This explains both the bright side and the dark side of religion. And I will try to elaborate on this as I go along. So we're not saying that everything's nice, right? In fact, there's no evolutionary theory that says everything's nice. Even a theory that says that groups evolve into adaptive units, those groups often compete and prey upon each other in the same way that individuals do, and so it elevates the problems up the biological hierarchy. It does not eliminate them. And finally, religion is a large subject, but it needs to be understood in terms of even larger subjects. So the big picture we're considering today is religion, but there's a big picture, human evolution, and all forms of human social organization. We want to know not only about religion, but about political organizations, small-scale human societies, all kinds of human social organizations. And finally, that needs to be understood against the background of the big picture, something called major transitions of evolution, which is a theory that can now covers everything from the origin of life to humans. So I'm painting a very broad portrait here. I don't know if I'm going to get to the end of it, but hopefully we'll have a good time along the way. And so we'll just keep on going here. So how do evolutionists study all traits? Before we talk about religion from an evolutionary perspective, let's just review how evolutionists study all traits, even something as mundane as spots on a guppy. And so the most basic question that an evolutionist wants to know when studying something is it an adaptation? Is this something that evolved because it enhanced survival and reproduction, as opposed to many non-adaptive products of evolution? Now, you know, the late evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould was famous for stressing that not everything that evolves is adaptive. There's many non-adaptive aspects of evolution. But that's the first thing we want to know when we're studying something. Is this an adaptation? And if it is an adaptation, we need to know the unit of selection. Did it evolve by benefiting whole groups compared to other groups? Or did it evolve as an individual level adaptation by benefiting individuals at the expense of others within groups? So in the case of religion, Durkheim's hypothesis basically is that the elements of religion are good for the religious group. But it's easy to imagine elements of religion that are actually deceptive, and they benefit some individuals, presumably the leaders, at the expense of other members of the same group, in which case that would be an individual level adaptation. And there's many examples of this. The abuses of the Catholic Church that led to the Protestant Reformation was certainly a case in which we can clearly identify that the leaders were exploiting the rank and file, and that's one thing that led to the Protestant Reformation. Now with cultural evolution, we have this interesting third possibility, because cultural traits hop from head to head. They bear an interesting resemblance to disease organisms. And in the same way that a disease organism can evolve to perpetuate its own transmission without being good for either individuals, human individuals, or groups, then it is theoretically possible, perfectly possible, that cultural traits can evolve to be organisms in their own right that spread at the expense of their human hosts. And this is what I like to call the demonic meme hypothesis. And I want to stress at this point, it's a perfectly legitimate hypothesis, theoretically perfectly plausible. It belongs in the list. So if a trait is not an adaptation, then how can it persist in the population? It's possible that it was adaptive in past environments, and our eating behaviors provide a great example. Our eating behaviors are killing us now. Most of our diseases, heart disease and obesity, diabetes, are basically caused by our inability to resist fats and sugars and so on. So that's maladaptive today. And of course, but if you go back to an environment of food scarcity, then these very same behaviors make perfect sense. So it's possible that a religion is like obesity, something that made great sense in the ancestral environment, small-scale societies of mostly of genetic relatives. Today we can't resist it any more than we can resist those foods. Someone says, "Brother, can you spare me a dime?" And you hear the word brother, and before you know it, you've reached into your pockets. Then another possibility is that religion is a byproduct of another trait, what Stephen Jay Gould calls spandrels. So that metaphor is that in architecture you might want to build some arches, and that's a functional part of the building. But by the very nature of building arches, you have created triangular spaces between the arches. There's no function to those spaces. You might use them for artwork or something like that, but it would be a mistake to say that those triangles were put there. It was the arches that were put there. And so it's possible that religion is functionless, has no function, might be costly, but it's connected to something else which does have a function in a non-religious context. And I'll give you a good example of that in just a second, a good possibility. And then finally, in evolution, we have traits that have no effect on fitness. They're neutral. We rely on these because that's what we make molecular clocks out of. A lot of genetic variation is neutral, and it's for that reason that you can look at the genetic differences among species, and you can infer their phylogenetic relationships. If the traits weren't neutral, then you wouldn't be able to do that. And no one would say, I think, that all of religion is neutral. That would be odd, but some elements of religion, the concept of religious drift, that religious beliefs come in and they just kind of drift around, the content of religious beliefs, I actually think that there's something very plausible about that hypothesis. Okay, and so these major hypotheses, which we evolutionists use to study all traits, provide an excellent framework for the study of religions. In fact, you can take all major theories of religion, past and present, and you can fit them into these categories without needing to invent new categories, as far as I can tell. And this by itself is a real contribution of evolutionary theory to be able to provide this organizational framework. So let me just give you all plausible. If they weren't plausible, they shouldn't be on the list. Okay? When you're a biological evolutionist, you have a number of major hypotheses, and they all could happen. If there was a hypothesis that never happened, then it wouldn't even belong on the list. So they all have articulate proponents. As I said before, they might be all true to some degree, but really we haven't made progress until we've taken specific cases and on a case-by-case basis decided the relative importance of these major hypotheses in order to make statements about religion. Because after all, these conceptions of religion are radically different from each other. A religion that is designed to benefit the group is going to look very different than religion as a tool of exploitation for the leaders against other members of the group, which is going to look very different than religion as like a disease organism that wastes its human host, which is going to look very different than religion as a form of obesity, which only makes sense in the context of an ancestral environment, which is going to look very different than religion as a byproduct of something else is perfectly useful once you understand the connections, which is going to look very different than religion as just something which is just neutral and drifts around. Okay? If we can't discriminate those conceptions of religion on the basis of empirical information, then the scientific process doesn't work very well. Here's an example of a byproduct hypothesis. It turns out that really the major prevailing hypothesis in the social sciences of religion is a byproduct hypothesis, although that term isn't used. This is the theory of Rodney Stark and his colleagues, a sociologist of religion. He's inspired by economic theory, and basically his theory of religion is that we have economic minds who are really good at cost-benefit reasoning, and we form explanations. Those explanations work pretty well, and that gets us all sorts of stuff in a non-religious context. So we don't have to puzzle about how this kind of thinking evolved. The benefits are manifest in a non-religious context. Okay? Well, it turns out there's some things we can't have, like rain during a drought or everlasting life. But that doesn't prevent us from wanting those things. And so the gods, basically, we invent the gods with whom to bargain for that which we can't have, basically. Religion is the economic mind spinning its wheels in order to get what we can't have. You can look and look, and you won't find any benefits to religion. But if you look at the mentality that's going into religion, and you look at that same mentality in a non-religious context, that's where you see the benefits of those traits. So that's a great example of a spandrel hypothesis. All-inclusive. Rodney Stark thinks he can explain everything about religion this way. And if you look at the more recent work of people like Pascal Boyer and Scott Atran, they're very similar. Basically, their conception of the mind is different from Stark's. It's more of an evolutionary conception based on evolutionary psychology rather than economic theory, but it's still very much a conception in which their understanding of human psychology now evolved in a non-religious context, and religion is a byproduct of that. And a lot of that article, of course, was devoted to Scott Atran's work. Now let's talk a little bit about the group level adaptation hypothesis. This goes back to Charles Darwin, who thought very hard about the problem of groups as adaptive units. And he said, and the problem with all forms of cooperation is that for society to work well, individuals must perform services for each other, and yet those other-oriented behaviors do not increase your fitness within the group. Usually selfish behaviors give you the highest fitness within the group. And that's the first part of this passage. It must not be forgotten that although a high standard of morality gives but a slight or no advantage to each individual man and his children over other men of the same tribe, I can't explain morality in terms of giving the moral individual an advantage compared to less moral individuals within his or her group, yet that an increase in the number of well-endowed men and advancement in the standard of morality will certainly give an immense advantage to one tribe over another. So the short rule is selfishness beats altruism within groups, but altruistic groups beat selfish groups. And so if there's a process of between group selection, then it becomes easy to explain morality, altruism, cooperation in all their forms, because these are manifestly good for the group. It's almost how we define them. So group selection makes them easy to explain. Now, that's not how the history of group selection went. Here's a very, very brief history of group selection invoked by Darwin, as we saw. And these for the good of the group arguments were widely and uncritically accepted during the first half of the 20th century. This is often called naive group selection. And then in the middle of the 20th century, group selection was widely rejected as an important evolutionary force. It even became a heresy, a taboo. And if any of you are biology students who have taken a course in evolution or animal behavior, you know it's often this is often still taught. Over the second half of the 20th century, there's been a revival of multi-level selection. This is what I do. But still, group selection's heretical reputation still casts a very long, long shadow over the field. And very interestingly, there is a parallel history in the social sciences. And the social sciences, as I've said, has not been strongly connected to evolutionary biology for most of the 20th century, but still we have a parallel history. So the idea of society as an organism was widely accepted until the middle of the 20th century, represented by the tradition of functionalism that Durkheim helped to initiate. And then it was largely replaced by methodological individualism at just about the same time that group selection was rejected in biology. And as a result, what was once common sense, the thinking of society as sort of like an organism in its own right, is now, and has been for most of the lifetimes of the people in this room, heretical or old-fashioned, rejected. And I think this is something that social historians should definitely study. Here's some examples. This is a quote from the contemporary psychologist Daniel Wegner at Harvard. He says, social commentators once found it very useful to analyze the behavior of groups by the same expedient used in analyzing the behavior of individuals. The group, like the person, was assumed to be sentient, to have a form of mental activity that guides action. Rousseau and Hegel were the early architects of this form of analysis, and it became so widely used in the 19th and early 20th century that almost every early social theorist we now recognize as a contributor to modern social psychology held a similar view. And yet by the 1990s, the late Don Campbell could say, methodological individualism dominates our neighboring field of economics, much of sociology, and all of psychology's excursions into organizational theory. This is the dogma that all human social group processes are to be explained by laws of individual behavior, that groups and social organizations have no ontological reality, that where used references to organization, etc., are but convenient summaries of individual behavior. What a change in perspective, basically, that somehow something happened that made groups disappear as adaptive units in the social sciences. In evolutionary biology, Helena Cronin said in the 90s, many an ecologist, equipped with no more than a flimsy analogy, marched cheerfully from the familiar Darwinian territory of individual organisms into a world of populations and groups. Populations were treated as individuals that just happened to be a notch or two up in the hierarchy of life. This was how not to think. And so again, something has happened that causes individuals to be a privileged level in the hierarchy of life. We can think of individuals as organisms, but we cannot think of anything above the individual as like a organism. And as in science, so also in everyday life, Margaret Thatcher famously said in 1987, there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. An extraordinary thing for a leader of a nation to say. Well, one of the things I want to do today is tell you what's been happening in the field of biology and evolutionary biology, which has changed all of this in a fundamental way. And so the big picture is what it means is a religion. The big picture is human evolution. The big picture is this concept of major transitions in evolution, which begins in the 1970s. So what's a major transition? Until the 1970s, evolution was thought to take place entirely by small mutational change. Individuals varied, and the best of those were selected. And now we know that evolution takes place along a second pathway by social groups becoming so functionally integrated that they become higher-level organisms in their own right. So the individuals of today are the groups of past ages. You might know about this because Lynn Margulis is the one who started it all off, and she's just right here in Amherst at UMass with her symbiotic origin of the eukaryotic cell. There she is. There she is being honored by Bill Clinton. Don't you miss him? What a wonderful man. Maybe we'll get him again, right? As first man. And this right here is not a disease contracted by Bill, but a eukaryotic cell, a nucleated cell with all of these internal structures here, the nucleus, the mitochondria, the flagella. And what Lynn said was that these structures, these complicated structures, did not evolve by slow mutational steps from bacteria, but evolved as a symbiotic community of bacteria becoming so functionally integrated that the organisms became organs. Okay? That's how functionally integrated they became. And in the 1990s, this concept was generalized, among others, by John Maynard Smith and Nus Svathmar, a Hungarian biologist, in their book, The Major Transitions in Evolution, to say that similar transitions have occurred repeatedly, starting perhaps with the origin of life as a community of cooperating molecular reactions that sustain each other, and then the first bacterial cells, eukaryotic cells, multicellular organisms. Social insect evolution fits very nicely into this scheme, and as we shall see, so also do human groups. And a major transition is all about multi-level selection. So basically, what we have here is when we have these groups, is that just as Darwin supposed, natural selection within groups favors selfish strategies that benefit themselves at the expense of other elements of the group. Natural selection between groups favors the cooperative strategy. It's exactly as Darwin supposed for his tribes. But the balance between levels of selection is not static. That can itself evolve. And a major transition occurs basically when mechanisms evolve that suppress within group selection and cause between group selection to become the dominating force. Here's an example. This is supposed to be a primordial cell in which the genes exist as free agents. The black genes here are solid citizen genes, so they're participating in the economy of the cell. They're cooperating and bringing in resources that everyone can use. This is a selfish gene here that's using those resources to replicate itself. And so you see it's increasing its representation within the cell. It's winning within this group. And then here we have the evolution of a chromosome, which very neatly solves the problem of within-group competition. By tying them all into a single structure that replicates as a unit, you've prevented within-group selection from taking place. And the only way that evolution can take place now, because there's no differential fitness within the cell, is by this cell doing better than other cells. And so between-group selection has become the dominating evolutionary force. And so major transitions have a number of hallmarks. In the first place, they are rare events in the history of life. It's not easy for this transition to occur. But when it does occur, there are momentous consequences. This new superorganism, this new group organism, is so competitively superior that it becomes ecologically dominant. And a third point is that the transition is never complete. So selfishness within groups is only suppressed, is never completely eliminated. And this is true even for organisms such as ourselves. The concept of an organism in its ideal form is totally harmonious, all of the parts working in harmony for the benefit of the whole. And that ideal organism doesn't exist anywhere, including in ourselves. All creatures have elements which are still today succeeding at the expense of the other genes within the same body. We call them diseases. And there's a whole book written on this, Intragenomic Conflict, a whole fascinating subject, Genes in Conflict by Austin Burt and Robert Trivers. And so let's savor the irony here. During the age of individualism, it became a heresy to think of a social group as like an organism. And now it turns out that the single organisms of today are literally the social groups of past ages. This is what's been happening in evolutionary biology. One way I like to illustrate this is the terms used in a single paper by David Haig at Harvard, who's one of the authorities on this, in an article called The Social Gene, use these words, which I've arranged in alphabetical order. You can see I only get up to O here, so there's another page of them. And so what he's doing is that he is using the language of human social interactions to describe genetic and developmental interactions within single organisms. And he's not doing this for the lay public. He's doing this for his own colleagues. That's the extent to which individual organisms are being studied and envisioned as social groups, basically, that are bound together so tightly that for the most part they are behaving in terms of the collective benefits, although with many exceptions. It's really extraordinary, simple but extraordinary when you pause to think. That's the degree to which we're thinking of individuals as like groups. And if this language of human social interactions is that appropriate, then can't we turn it around and start to think of human groups as like organisms, at least to an extent? This is something which has become quite plausible. So insect eusociality fits right into this. All the hallmarks. It was a rare event in the history of life. Ed Wilson and Bert Holdobler at Harvard estimate that many thousands of species of social insects now, but in terms of origination events, only originated about 15 times as far as we can tell. But once it did evolve, there were these superorganisms were so competitively dominant that now over half the biomass of all insects, if you go out into the field and weigh the insects, you'll find that over half the biomass is wrapped up in social insects. And yet cheating does take place when you study these social insect colonies carefully. There's all kinds of palace intrigue, individuals benefiting their matrilines and patriline's. And the reason it doesn't happen more is not only because they're genetically related, but also because of social control, policing mechanisms it's called. So there's another case where we're taking a term from human social interactions and we're applying it to the social insects. Now one thing that's great about the social insects and that distinguishes them from the previous major transitions is that a social insect colony, the members are not physically connected to each other. On any given day, if you go to a beehive, the workers are dispersed over an area of several square kilometers. But nevertheless, they interact in such a coordinated fashion that they still qualify as a superorganism. And for this to happen, it is essential that social interactions function in the same way as neuronal interactions. And individuals have a nervous system, and so their nerves are interacting in a way that's for the common good. In a social insect colony or any other dispersed organism, then social interactions have to occupy that role. And this is represented by the term social physiology among social insect biologists. So if we think about the group mind, it might sound like science fiction. When I typed the group mind into Google, I got this comic book. Over the centuries, we evolved a group mind, each being contributing selflessly to one overall consciousness, exploring, learning, unbounded by time or space. It turns out this is literally true and beautifully well documented in social insects by people such as Tom Seeley at Cornell University. And I know I'm supposed to be talking about religion, but let me just give you this one great example of group-level mentality in social insects. So this is an experiment that Seeley does where he takes a beehive deep into the Adirondack woods where there's no floral resources, and he creates his own resources in the form of a patch here, a feeder here, and a feeder here, each one 100 meters from this hive. And in the morning, he puts nectar in both of them, but this is the best resource. It has a more concentrated sugar solution. And over the course of a few hours, most of the workers are going to this patch. And then at noon, he switches it so that this is now the best resources. And within a few hours, most of the bees are going to this patch. So somehow, the bees have perceived this difference, and they're now behaving in a way that's smart. He's demonstrating that they made a smart decision. And he also knows how they did it, because each and every bee has been marked with a little numbered and colored tag. And Tom is there in the hive looking through a glass pane, seeing everyone coming and going. And he has assistants stationed at both of the feeders. And so they know everything that happened. And what happens is that no bee, or very few bee, visits both stations. And so no bee has a frame of comparison to make a decision. Now, you know about the famous bee dance, right? The bees come back, and it turns out that they dance. The length of their dance is proportional to the quality of the food. And then there's other bees there that are watching this. And so you might think that they make the comparison there, but it turns out that no bee compares the dances of other bees. All they do, if they're going to become a forager, is that they pick a dancing bee at random, and then they go to the appropriate food source. Now, so how does this work? There's a statistical bias that's imposed by the fact that the ones returning from the best resource dances longer. So even if you pick a bee at random, there's a statistical bias which is going to cause the bees to go to the better resources without anyone making a decision. So no individual made a decision, but the social interactions were structured so that as a network they did make a decision. That's what it means to have a group mind. And just before I proceed, just think about that possibility in human social interactions, and you'll see how interesting that might be. So all of this is so new, really, within the 1990s. Yet human evolution is really just fitting into this paradigm as a major transition. A rare event, you bet. There's only one eusocial, ultra-social primate species, that's us. Wasn't easy, evidently. Momentous consequences once it occurs. You bet. After this groupish species came into existence, it spread over the globe and displaced all other hominid species and many other species along on the way. And so we truly, I don't know what our biomass is compared to all other species, but I don't think I have to belabor the point that our species has become ecologically dominant. The transition is never complete, you bet. There's all kinds of selfishness and palace intrigue that takes place within human groups. That does not deny the fact that often that when we succeed, we're succeeding as groups, not just as individuals at the expense of other individuals within groups. So people who think about human evolution often think what I call the 3 C's. What's so special about humans? We're very cooperative, at least compared to other primate species. We have very special cognition. And of course, we have culture. We're transmitting information all the time. The way we behave is not directly from our genes, but usually socially learned in some sense. And until recently, the thinking has been is that the first thing that happened was our special cognition, something like a theory of mind. So now we had a special way of thinking about the intentions of others, and that enabled us to be cooperative. This is the work of Michael Tomasello, among others. But he has changed his mind, and I think it's much more reasonable to suppose that the first thing that happened was this major transition. The first C was cooperation. And both cognition, symbolic thought and language, and culture, transmitting information, are fundamentally communal activities that require trustworthy social partners. And so the first problem to solve is this major transition, and then these other things could have evolved. And so what might have been the first human adaptation? This is a very interesting scenario by a guy named Paul Bingham. Stone throwing might have been the first human adaptation. We moved out into the savannah. Stone throwing evolved for the reasons that you'd expect, to chase away scavengers and things like that. And you know, we can throw stones with unparalleled ability compared to any other primate. And this required anatomical changes all throughout the body. If you look at how a baseball pitcher throws a baseball, it's not just their arms, it's the whole body. And so massive anatomical changes were required for this. And then as soon as we could throw stones with deadly force, we could stone each other. I told you I was going to get to religion. And so the general version of this hypothesis is due to Chris Boehm, a wonderful anthropologist, in his book Hierarchy in the Forest, which basically it says is that the typical primate dominance hierarchy, the biggest males sort of intimidate the other males, and they get all the women, and they get all the food, and that's not a context for cooperation. And the younger one, the subordinate animals resent it, but there's nothing they can do about it. But now, if you can now stand at a distance and collectively throw stones at the alpha male, or in other ways basically suppress the alpha male, you flip the dominance hierarchy, and now you have this kind of egalitarian, which is not the kind that Rousseau imagined. No, it's more of a guarded kind. You know, there's plenty of people that want to be dominant, but they can't be because everyone has sort of the ability to collectively restrain each other. And so it could be this that accounted for the major transition, not a cognitive event, but something like this, which started everything off. So what does it mean to take the concept of human society seriously, as an organism seriously? This is one of my favorite quotes from Tocqueville, who wrote so perceptively about American democracy in comparison to French society in the 1800s. Also had this to say about human small-scale society. The village or township is the only association which is so perfectly natural that wherever a number of men are collected, it seems to constitute itself. So what does it mean to really take this seriously? That there's something about our innate psychology that without any training or just sort of as naturally as seeing or hearing, you throw a small number of people together and they just operate like a unit. So some statements. Humans are genetically adapted to function as coordinated units at the level of small face-to-face society. Cognitive activities that can benefit from teamwork in addition to physical activities. So most of the scenarios about human evolution have been about physical cooperation, but we should really think in terms of mental cooperation, basically, group mind sorts of things. And that these mechanisms might be very complex, but so automatic that we perform them without thinking. I think vision is a good metaphor. We don't have to think about seeing, but when we study seeing, it is mind-bogglingly complex. I think that when you look at people interacting socially, erupting into a conversation about something of mutual interest, for example, we do it without thinking, but what might be actually going on might be extraordinarily complex once we study it scientifically. And so this whole subject can be applied to many subjects, including but not restricted to religion. And I am going to get to religion, but I am going to pass through just a couple other cool topics first, having to do with some of this basic innate psychology before we get to culture. So here are the eyes, the windows of the soul. Human eye has a white sclera and an iris that's visually very contrasting. The eye is horizontally elongated, and what this means is that the eye is an organ of communication in addition to an organ of vision. We're giving information to our social partners just by the way the eye is morphologically structured. I can look at any one of you and I can see where you're looking, regardless of which way your head is pointing. Okay? And I can infer a lot of emotional states as well. Well, it turns out that our eyes are unique among all primates. I did not know this until I started reading the literature, but every other primate species, including our closest relatives, the great apes, have eyes that are round, they're deep set in the eyes, there's not horizontal elongation, the sclera is the same color as the rest of the face, and so basically they have evolved not to give out information. And so this cooperation has been so prevalent for so long that it's reflected not only in our behaviors and our psychology, but also in our morphology. Pointing, what could be simpler or more natural than pointing? Babies do it. Well, it turns out that apes are dumbfounded by the idea of pointing. They don't point to each other, and even apes raised in captivity might learn to point to things that they want, but they never, as far as I understand the literature, never get to the point where they point things out to others. That's the degree to which human society has been cooperative and ape society has not. And these are genetic changes that must take place. A confirmation of this is it turns out that dogs are much better at understanding pointing than apes. Often when you just know a little bit about animal behavior, you think there's some sort of scale of nature and humans are on top and then apes and dogs would be way down. But no, that's not the way it is at all. For this particular cognitive skill, dogs understand pointing. And you want to do what experiment do you want to do? What about wolves? What about wolves raised in captivity? And it turns out that dogs are better than wolves raised in captivity. And so basically what dogs did was joined cooperative human society about 70,000 years ago, I believe, is the estimate. And that provided enough time in terms of genetic evolution in order for them to sort of start developing this kind of cooperative cognition. If a dog tries to do something and fails, the first thing it does is look to its human associate, because the human associate is a source of information and has been for a long, long time. And that's what doesn't exist for wolves or for apes. Okay, finally, infant cognition. This is also the work of Michael Tomasello. So an experiment where an adult gestures ambiguously towards 3 toys and says to a young child, "Oh, wow, that's so cool. Can you give it to me?" And they've played with 2 of the toys previously. There's only 1 toy that's new to the adult. All 3 toys are familiar to the infant. Okay? And the adult is just vaguely gesturing towards all 3. And even 1-year-old children tend to give the adult the toy that the adult had not played with. That's the degree to which even human infants are aware of the needs and the states and the histories of their social partners. And apes do not do this at any age. So we're talking about fundamental aspects of human cognition. And then finally, cultural evolution. I am going to have to go to religion here, but I think that there's just the basic concept here is that because humans radiated all over the globe, but unlike the social insects, they did not turn into hundreds of species. Nevertheless, they did fill hundreds of ecological niches. So depending on where you go, we eat everything from seeds to whales. All climatic regions, we invaded the sea in boats. And so we became ecologically very diverse, at the same time genetically remaining a single species. What this means is that cultural diversity should be studied in the same way as biological diversity. That's a simple thing to say, but it's really profound when you take it to its conclusions. Okay, returning to religion. Only about 5 more minutes and we're done here. So actually my interest in religion was prompted by this wonderful passage here written 350 years ago by a member of the Hutterite faith, which says, "True love means growth for the whole organism, whose members are all interdependent and serve each other. That is the outward form of the inner working of the spirit, the organism of the body governed by Christ. We see the same thing among the bees who all work with equal zeal gathering honey." So here, and if you're familiar with religious discourse, you know that the metaphor of the religious group is like a single body and like a beehive is extremely common. Here's an artistic expression. This is the stained glass window at St. John's Cathedral, St. John's University in Minnesota. And it's a beautiful rendering of the inspirational art of a stained glass window in which the honeycomb motif has been worked into the design. And so basically, against this background that I've been telling you, what this means is this is not, or might not be, just a poetic metaphor. We can treat it as a serious scientific hypothesis that religious groups are indeed like single organisms, and that the religion plays an important part in their social physiology, basically. If we look at religious beliefs and practices, we'll find that they're perhaps very finely adapted to cause the particular groups to do well in their particular social environments. And so what this means is that the group-level adaptation hypothesis has become a force to be reckoned with. Okay, so let me just give you some examples from my book, Darwin's Cathedral. And one of the things that I did was basically I became like a natural historian. I looked at particular case studies of religion to see how well they were adapted to their environments. And what I was gratified was that the religious scholars would basically state my hypothesis back to me, although not necessarily using the E word. So this is Alistair McGrath, a Calvin scholar. So we're talking about Calvin. So Calvinism began in a single time and place, the city of Geneva in the 1500s. And McGrath says, events in the absence of Farel and Calvin. I'm not sure how much background to give, but basically they came in during the Protestant Reformation to reform the city of Geneva, which was trying to exist as a political entity, but failing because of factionalism. Factionalism was called the Genevan disease. Basically, they couldn't cooperate with each other, even though they had a strong civic government. And Calvin and his associate Farel came in, they outlined this religious agenda, and it was so stark that they were expelled from the city. 3 years later, they were humbly invited back, and that's what we have here. Events in the absence of Farel and Calvin had demonstrated the close interdependence of reformation and autonomy, of morals and morale. Although the city council was concerned primarily with the independence and morale of the city, the fact that Farel's religious agenda could not be evaded gradually dawned. The pro-Farel party probably had little enthusiasm for religious reformation or the enforcement of public morals. Nevertheless, it seemed that the survival of the Genevan Republic hinged upon them. So basically, this religion made the community, the group, hang together more than it did otherwise. And this juxtaposition of the words morale and morality, I think, is really beautiful. What it's saying is that in order to have a strong morale, motivation to action, you need to have strong morals, a sense of right and wrong. And so this is part of the connection between religion and community. I am going to skip over some of this. This is a quote from John Wesley, founder of Methodism, who says, "I do not see how it is possible in the nature of things for any revival of true religion to continue for long. For religion must necessarily produce both industry and frugality, and these cannot but produce riches. But as riches increase, so will pride, anger, and love of the world and all its branches." So Wesley, a religious man himself, very clearly saw a kind of dynamic which has been shown to exist all around the world, which is that basically the people that need to cooperate with each other, religion causes them to cooperate. That causes them to become wealthy, and now they have an incentive not to cooperate anymore with each other, but to do business with the world. And so religions become corrupt, and also religions are not just for the good of the group. Exploitation does take place, and so we have some haves and some have-nots, and those that are not being served by their religion go off and form a new purified religion. It amounts to a kind of a life cycle of religions which have been taking place throughout history. Well, these are nice examples, but of course one can be accused of selection bias. And to solve this problem, one thing I did was I chose a random sample of religions, chosen without reference to any particular hypothesis. I invented a little computer program that went to an encyclopedia of religion and chose volume numbers and page numbers at random, and basically picked 35 religions out of a hat. And this is written up in an article that's on my website. And let me just tell you about one of these religions, the most challenging of the religions in my sample, Jainism, one of the oldest religions in India. About 3,000 years old. It's practiced by about 3% of the Indian population. One of the world's most ascetic religions. Jain renunciates, they're the ones that filter the water that they drink and the air that they breathe. They wear masks, and they have a broom that they sweep the path in front of them to avoid killing any small unseen creatures. And one of their aspirations is to fast themselves to death, as this man is doing here. Surely, if the demonic meme hypothesis is going to hold for any religion, it should be a religion such as this. Doesn't this person look like he's been wasted by a disease? How could a religion like this be good for either individuals or groups? Until you read the scholarly literature. And so when you do read the scholarly literature, you come up with books like this, whose title says it all: Riches and Renunciation, Religion, Economy, and Society Among the Jains. And it turns out that the ascetic Jains are a tiny fraction of the religion, whose lay members are among the wealthiest merchants of India. And the Jain religion is very much fills an economic niche similar to the Jews in Western Europe and merchant societies all around the world, Chinese in Asia, Indians in Africa, a particular economic niche in which trade and cooperation has to occur along very large, diffuse networks. And that kind of cooperation is facilitated by this very, very strong religion. And here's an example, one of the most amazing examples. So these Jain ascetics, they must beg for food, but their food restrictions are so severe that they could only accept food from the most pious Jain households. And so what they do is that they go from house to house, and when they enter a house, they inspect it minutely for purity and for the devoutness of its members. And if they leave without food, that's a mark of shame for the entire, public shame for the entire community. If they leave with food, that's a mark of honor. And so who would have thought prior to information about the religion that the Jains are actually functioning, the ascetics, among other things, are functioning as a kind of a policing force in order to maintain the religion. And this is only one example. Okay, I really am wrapping up here, but let me just give this quote. This is now from the author himself, and the point that I'm trying to make, I made it early on, is that our current understanding of religion is like our understanding of geology and natural history before the theories of Lyell and Darwin. And what that means is that these people did not have a theory of their own, but they were providing really good descriptive information. They were accurately describing what they were seeing, and that can be interpreted by the theories. So Laidlaw is saying this: how then is it possible to live by impossible ideals? The advantage for addressing this question to Jainism is that the problem is so very graphic there. The demands of Jain asceticism have a pretty good claim to be the most uncompromising of any enduring historical tradition, the most aggressively impractical set of injunctions which any large number of diverse families and communities has ever tried to live by. They've done so, albeit in a turbulent history of change, schism, and occasional recriminatory reform for well over 2 millennia. This directs our attention to the fact that yawning gaps between hope and reality are not necessarily dysfunctions of social organization or deviations from religious systems. The fact that lay Jains make up what is, in thoroughly worldly material terms, one of the most conspicuously successful communities in India only makes more striking and visible a question which must also arise in the case of the renouncers themselves. I like to call this the transformation of the obvious. With a little information, Jainism appears obviously dysfunctional for both individuals and groups, like a cultural parasite. With more information, the same information becomes obviously functional, so much that there isn't much controversy, at least at this level, amongst the scholars. And in this fashion, when you look at the entire sample and at religions in general, I think that actually, although it might not be obvious today, at the end of the day, it will become obvious that most enduring religions are functioning very impressively on behalf of their members. All right, I'm just going right to the end here. So I've given you a lot of stuff, and what I like to call the big picture, against which provides the background for these big subjects that are also big, is described in more detail in my book, Evolution for Everyone. So thank you very much.
You have given us a fascinating account of how religions arise from nature, from biology, if you like. What do you think of Stephen Jay Gould's belief that science and religion are non-overlapping magesteria?
I disagree with it, basically, and I think that that's a very common solution, and I think it's a good halfway solution, to be honest. I think the best halfway solution is to agree that when we study any aspect of the world, we need to be naturalists. And you might have religious beliefs, but those religious beliefs need to be compatible with naturalism. And there's many kinds of religious beliefs are compatible with naturalism. I would love to get everybody to that point. But then there's another step, which is a little bit more controversial. And that as soon as you start putting religion under that lens, as I've tried to do today, and you start explaining its details with something which is very impressively designed to cause groups to function with us, that are otherwise explicable from an evolutionary perspective. Well, now you've explained religious beliefs so well that way, there really does not seem to be that much left over for another region. And that's my personal opinion. So I'm really a thoroughgoing atheist, you might say, as far as wanting to be naturalistic from beginning to end. This is my own personal. Yeah.
How would you explain with the evolutionary theory the rise of like New Age movements in the contemporary society, where the individuals don't necessarily want to be reliant on the community, but they believe that they're spiritual beings who can just rely on themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. How can we explain these so-called New Age movements? And I think one point to make is that they tend to exist primarily in affluent societies. And in general, there's a relationship between not just the affluence of the society, but the safety and basically how well organized it is. European societies are better examples of this than American society. American society is very secure for a few people, but it's like a third world nation for many other people. But there's a wonderful book called Sacred and Secular by Norris and Engelhardt, which is a worldwide study of religions, and they show very, very clearly that as a society becomes more safe and secure, as in Western Europe, then religion sort of becomes weaker, church attendance goes down, and so on. Now, people still do have spiritual needs, and so there's a very interesting set of issues to explore there. But my conjecture would be is that when people's material needs are taken care of pretty well by their secular society, then they still have spiritual needs and they still express them, and that would be in part what some of the New Age movements might be. But that they would be not adequate in a situation where you really needed to get more out of your religion.
I'm not really clear on what the causal hypothesis is here. I mean, clearly, you've shown that cooperation is good at a group level, and humans are really good at that. And so it's not surprising that religions would make use of cooperation, since that's really good for us. But actually, your hypothesis seems to be that having supernatural beliefs causes cooperation. And I'm just not quite sure where that comes from or what the evidence for it is supposed to be.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And the problem that we need to wrestle with, I think, is when we include religion along with other kinds of social organization. And if both of them are functional, a political organization is functional plus a religious organization, what is it about the religious part per se? Just trying to think of how I can say this in a short space. Let me actually go back to a slide that I skipped. I think, here's what I think is the most fundamental thing to say about this. It's a trade-off between what I call factual and practical realism. So factual realism are beliefs that act, sort of scientific beliefs that accurately represent the world. Practical realism are beliefs that cause people to behave adaptively in the world. And the point to make here is that natural selection is sensitive only to practical realism. When you take an evolutionary perspective on human mentality and sociality, everything that we think, everything that our brains do, needs to be explained in terms of how it gets us to behave. And the relationship between those beliefs that are successful in a practical sense and how well those beliefs correspond to the world is a very complicated trade-off. What makes religion so striking is that they depart so much from factual realism in the way that they become practically realistic. And I think that's the direction to go in explaining a religious group compared to another kind of group. I hope we have it. I feel that's inadequate for lack of time, but I think that's
Another talk, maybe, or another book.
yeah. Up there.
Sure.
There's you and then you. Go ahead.
Well, how do you explain the belief in the transcendental or transcendent that people do have? For example, just as Douglas held, we are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being. I'm not saying I agree with that. In fact, I think it's very faulty. But it was very rhetorically effective.
Yeah, and I think it's important to appreciate the diversity that exists, even within religions. And that's something that you would expect from an evolutionary perspective, especially if you take cultural evolution seriously. And there's religious scholars make a distinction between the horizontal component of religion, that's the communitarian aspect, and the vertical component of religion, that's the beliefs that you have about God and the theological beliefs. And so we can make two statements. One is, and this is an empirical question, how tightly is the vertical component yoked to the horizontal component? All kinds of theological beliefs you might have, some of them would cause you to behave in wildly dysfunctional ways. And so if we study religions and we find that for the most part, the vertical component is very tightly yoked to the horizontal component, that is a very important conclusion to arrive at. And that's basically what I've been saying here. But then there's another conclusion, which is, and this is inherent, if you're an evolutionist, you know that there's a many-to-one relationship between proximate and ultimate causations. What that means is that for something that evolves, there's many specific mechanisms that could cause it to be implemented. When we think that way in terms of religion, then that explains part of the diversity of religion. To make it look more concrete, you might already know this, but I was stunned to discover, and it's obvious in retrospect, if you take something like beliefs in the afterlife, which many people reflexively would just say is going to be a fundamental of religion. Not only is it not a fundamental of religion, but even the comparison between Christianity and Judaism is very different. That the afterlife is much more marginal in Judaism than in Christianity. So it's not the case that Christianity just was an offshoot of Judaism. It became fundamentally different in this particular way. And why might that be? What do Jews have that's highly motivating and that doesn't require belief in the afterlife that Christians don't have? That's the degree to which you're starting to think of religions that are all, for the most part, working well for their members, but in very different ways. And I think we need to appreciate the differences among religions in just this way. Now, ma'am, up there.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you.
It's a little too vague at this point. I don't ask.
Oh no, I'm trying to get women and men. There you go. Yes.
Thank you. So you talk about the networking in the society make this decision as a group. So is it possible to apply that idea to human society? So networking in human actually leads to religion or something. How do you think?
Well, they're separate. I mean, there's two subjects. One is the concept of group level cognitive processing in humans. Okay, what a great subject. And it's not as if it's never been studied, but and I study this very actively, but if you look at the psychological literature on group decision making, group memory, group problem solving, it's not as if it never occurred to them. But it really needs to be rethought, and the opportunities for groups behaving as mental units is just a tremendous subject, regardless of whether it's in a religious context or a non-religious context. So the concept of group level cognition, that's a great topic, which could be played out either in a religious context or in a non-religious context. I hope is that your question? Did I address your question?
Yeah, and also not only religion, but it can be applied to the many other different aspects of the human society.
Oh, absolutely, and especially in a more spontaneous way in small groups. Gossip is an example. If you look at gossip, perennially understudied subject because it's, everyone does it, so we don't think about studying it. But the fact is that gossip is extremely complex and context sensitive in a way that is multifunctional. So gossip would be one good example. Sir?
I noticed and welcomed the shift that you just made in the prior comment from using religion in the singular as a substantive to the plural, because I'm just interested in having you comment on this. In a lot of the recent commentary and work in the theory of religion, theologians and historians of religion have become increasingly concerned about the extent to which religion is pitched as a capital R substantive in the singular. And more, I mean, if you were to characterize a lot of the work that's gone on in the last 20 years, like with the book by Talal Assad on the genealogies of religion, that people have begun to question the confidence that people in general and even scholars have had in thinking that we know what religion is, right? That the closer that you look at that, the more across the world and throughout the ages, it seems like there's more diversity and more. So I worry sometimes in these kinds of discussions where religion and science are pitched against each other, that we're too quick to reify religion as a singular entity, which, you know, what your comment suggests, it really isn't. And then we're thinking in our minds about, when we talk about religion, we're really thinking about Christianity. And when we're thinking about Christianity, we're thinking about evangelical Christianity and so forth, or Islam.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Religion is a very fuzzy set. And almost every element of religion that's at the heart of religion will also be at the heart of other things as you go beyond religion. So basically, we agree with each other very much. In my book, I have a chapter on what I call stealth religions. And my candidate for a stealth religion is Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. And in this chapter, what I show is that although Ayn Rand was an atheist and called herself a rationalist and so on, if you look at her belief system, it is definitely just like a fundamentalist religion. And it was a massive distortion of the world. That's what makes it so strong. That's why people are still reading that book 50 years later, is that it provides a world for them to step into, and it just shoots them like a cannon, a motivational cannon, completely destroys the facts of the world, and the fact that it doesn't invoke supernatural agents is truly a detail. So I think what I'm trying to do is to emphasize this trade-off here. That's something you can really get your teeth into, that all brains, including the human brain, has evolved to motivate adaptive behaviors. That often involves massive distortions of reality. And then whether that takes the form that in the modern day we recognize as religion or not is truly a detail. So I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Is there evidence to suggest that there are neurological parts of the brain that are responsible for religious feelings or beliefs? And if so, when those parts of the brain get knocked out, do people also lose the ability to reason in moral or altruistic ways?
Most people would tell you, and I would largely agree, that it's hard to find something that is specifically religious, and your comment is on the back of that comment, of what do we mean by specifically religious. But certainly most of my colleagues would say that what evolved has much to do with social interactions and policing, and so the elements of morality evolved, has a genetic architecture, but not something that we could identify with religion per se. And what religions are making use of these things that evolve for other reasons. In that sense, they're byproducts, but they're being turned into highly functional adaptations by cultural evolution. Would be the God gene by Hammer. What that is saying is that some of these elements of religiosity are genetically heritable, okay? Which is a very far cry from saying that they actually evolved in order to do anything with respect to religion. So I'm afraid that's another, I need about 5 or 10 minutes to make that more clear, but I'm sorry to have concentrated over here. Yeah.
Thank you for that was one of the most stimulating talks I've been to in quite a while. I think I'm asking the same question in 2 different ways. And the first is, if I understand the basic argument, it is that religion is an adaptive trait at the group level that helps groups survive and flourish. So one way of asking the question is, how would we disprove this hypothesis? Another way of asking what I think is the same question, but I'm not sure, is supposing we substituted something like traffic laws or democracy, and we said that these are adaptations, group-level adaptations that are good for the groups, would we then want to look for an evolutionary basis for traffic laws or for something like democracy?
Right. Good questions both, and a good question is hard to answer in a short space. With respect to being able to prove it,
Or disprove it, actually.
or disprove it, I think that that is possible and essentially what I've tried to do. And so I'll give you an example of something which clearly counts as not a group level adaptation. Okay? Corruption. What is corruption? What is nepotism? It's basically you're clearly handing benefits to a smaller group, not the bigger group. So a country that's really plagued by corruption is manifestly doing poorly as a corporate unit at that level, often because the social scale that is adaptive is a much smaller social scale. And the social scientist Robert Putnam has a beautiful book called Making Democracy Work, which is a detailed analysis of southern Italy and the provinces of Italy. And what he demonstrates is that these provincial governments vary greatly in just how well they work. He measured as such things as just send a letter to your official and see how long it takes to get back. So you can measure how well something works, and that can be done for a social group as well as another group. Traffic laws are definitely part of the infrastructure of secular society, and traffic laws might work well or poorly. So it's easy to interpret those as a group level adaptation, something that's causing the whole group to function well. Now, how did that come into being? Okay, that might have come into being by a raw process of cultural evolution, and there's good examples of this. To a large extent, the societies that are here today are just what hung together many social experiments, a few that succeed. Well, other things, though, are deliberately planned. So clearly there's intentional planning, there's sort of cognitive processes that cause these things to come into play. Yet what you need to do, and I'm compressing a whole lot, is to, whenever you explain something, not by virtue of an evolutionary process, but by virtue of a psychological process, you simply have to ask, how did that psychological process evolve? And so what you've done is you've moved your evolutionary inquiry back a step. But there's still, at the end of the day, all roads lead to evolution, is one way to put it. You know, economists and social scientists who don't think in terms of evolution, they're not creationists. What they think actually is that their account is consistent with evolution, but in a way that does not require detailed knowledge of evolution. And it's that assumption which is failing massively, basically, in all fields. Economics is a good example. People are deciding all on their own that rational choice theory is not going to explain human behavior very well. And so therefore, we have to find out more what actually drives human behavior, and then that is going to search for a theoretical framework, and that theoretical framework is going to come to evolution. Herbert Gintis, some of you might know him, is one of the main actors in this, and he's right here in UMass also. Well, he comes back eventually, occasionally, doesn't he?
One more question.
Sir?
If religion as you propose is subject to natural selection and evolution, then what are the factors of inheritance? Are they immaterial, are they behavioral, or are they based in human genetics? And if so, where are these genes?
Another great question that deserves a long answer, and the short answer is, I think that there is a really nice analogy to be made with the immune system. So the immune system is a very complex, genetically evolved adaptation against disease organisms, but it does not take the form of a specific solution to every different kind of disease. Okay? What it is it's a fast-paced evolutionary process built by genetic evolution. So evolution is now taking place at 2 time scales. There needs to be a genetic evolutionary story to explain the architecture of the immune system. And then the immune system itself is functioning as an evolutionary process, generating antibodies to particular diseases. And there's other processes like that, psychological processes and cultural processes that are like that. So you need to account for the genetic architecture, but then you need to account for the faster paced process. And with cultural evolution, you need to find out how are these things passed from person to person, from generation to generation. And religions are especially good for that because they're quite organized as far as that goes. That's what catechisms are about, and methods of enculturation. And it's probably better, cultural transmission is better orchestrated for religious cultures than for most other cultures, especially conservative religious cultures. And we have good data about this. We know the retention rate, for example, of different religious denominations, and they can be very high indeed. So it's a great topic, and one of the things that it does, I think, maybe this could be a nice thing to leave us with, is that at a very elementary level, when you would think of a group as like an organism, we know that organisms are so very complex in their anatomy and their physiology. And if groups are like organisms, there has to be that something approaching that kind of complexity in the way we function as groups. And our social behaviors and our cultures has to give us something akin to a genome and a replication process, which is high fidelity, something akin to development. And so I think that although it's new or newly new to think about this society as organism, there's all kinds of potential which begins just at this metaphorical level.
Well, thank you very much.